Hello, good afternoon. Today, the last lecture in the schedule, and I will talk about two things primarily. As time got very short during the 3 months that I was here, I couldn't really cover everything that I found interesting for you. So today I want to present two things, but a little bit more compressed. The first part is about some aspects of the ontogenetic development of language, because I understand that some of you are journalists, some of you are sociologists, so we have a mixture of students here, and all these different disciplines have to do with communication and language, of course. So it's always nice to know some things about language in general. Let's just start with the ontogenetic development. So let's just quickly repeat the different levels of development and timescales that play a role in psychology and social psychology. First, we see, let's start in the end here. What we briefly touched in the beginning, in the first lecture, was the phylogenetic development, which has an influence on certain aspects of human psychology. That is some attributes that mankind shares across different cultures. It's certain capabilities that we have that allow us to participate in the human enterprise, so to say, to construct cultures, to build cultures, and to have some behaviors in common, some preferences that we need for our very basic needs of existence, like, for example, procreation, like, for example, certain preferences in languages. The second one is the changes that occur in the sociocultural timescale. These are historical changes and play a role within millennia or hundreds of years or millennia. And there we develop our local cultures that are influencing us very much in the life course. These local cultures develop or give us an adaptation to the technologies that exist, an adaptation to the social organization that emerges out of a long history that determines how we organize our life together with the others. The ontogenetic change is something that everybody of us starts to experience from the very beginning of the birth, or maybe even before birth, that concerns the changes that occur within the years or decades of our lifetime, and that determine our personal preferences, and the personal preferences and behaviors that we have and that we live in during our life. And last but not least, the changes, the actual genetic changes that are accessible for our conscious endeavor are those changes that occur in learning, here and now, for example. Things that you experience, things that you hear, and that you assimilate to your understanding of the world. Most of the other things are not so easily accessible to our conscious reflection. But why do I do this? Because I want to illustrate that ontogenetic changes cannot exist without sociocultural influences over the millennia, and those cannot exist without the phylogenetic basis that exists and constitutes our being here. For example, language learning is an example of that. Language learning is a good example of that because it unites phylogenetic influences, genetic apparatus that we carry, everybody of us carries, and the influence of culture. Formerly, in let's say 50 to 100 years ago, there were several theories that tried to explain language attainment of children. The first one, or one of the most influential, was Skinner. You probably have heard about the name Skinner, who suggested that language learning is nothing else than instrumental conditioning. It would mean that when a child says, "Ma," and the mama says, "Ah, you've said mama, oh, wonderful, great, nice girl." The behavior of the mother would be conditioning, let's say a reinforcement, that leads to the child repeating this sound again and again because it was reinforced. And out of this, may sometimes become the word mama. So we have the sound that the parents react to it, a reinforcement with their reaction, and this sound becomes more frequent. The problem with this is that there is a poverty of stimulus problem. What does this mean? The poverty of stimulus problem states that children have a capacity to speak complex, relatively complex expressions at the age of 6, 7, 8 years that they could never have experienced during their former life of 6 years. Meaning that there are not enough stimuli that the children meet during their early lifetime in order to see their complex utterances as a mere reinforcement learning, so as a instrumental conditioning. So the language that kids learn cannot be pure learning according to the older theories, but you need something that is more or less an interaction of phylogenetic basis imprinted in our genetic and finally neuronal apparatus that lets us as kids, as children, young children, learn a language that is being spoken in the vicinity, in a family, for example. Meaning, the child learns or grows up as a baby and toddler and later as a small child in a family which produces certain sounds regularly. These sounds we call language as adults, and the child hears the sounds. And obviously by some genetic apparatus, it is put in the position to learn quickly to distinguish between certain parts of these sounds that have different meanings. And it was Chomsky primarily who suggested something that could explain better than other learning theories before this process of language attainment by children. So according to him, there is a generative transformation grammar being imprinted with us. We carry a genetically imprinted or genetically formed capacity with us that allows us to discriminate out of the sounds being produced in our cultural environment what we understand nowadays as nominal phrases and verbal phrases. Every language that is spoken on earth, every symbolic language, has nominal phrases and verbal phrases. Nominal phrases are usually the subjects of a sentence, and the verbal phrase is the verb plus some object. So in this example sentence, the dog chases the cat, we see that the nominal phrase, the dog does some activity that is in this case particularly chasing cats. But this basic structure of nominal phrases, verbal phrases, irrespective of how it is being implemented in each of the many hundreds or even thousands of languages in Earth, are present in different forms, in different shapes. And these are the learning or the extraction of these phrases out of the stream of sounds that a child overhears in his or her family is something that could not be done without a genetically preformed apparatus, with which I want to illustrate actually the importance of phylogenetic and genetic processes, natural preconditions that are necessary for our culture. Without language learning, which is a part of culture learning, we would not be the people we are, members of a society, members of a culture. And this very difficult process of language attainment as a child is a result of a very basic, actually naturally preformed, genetically dependent process. So that's the structure, the grammar, so to say, of a language. But then children must also learn the phonetics of languages. In Estonian, you have this nice O with a tilde or whatever it call it, which for non-Estonians is a little bit difficult to pronounce, like Peder. I don't get it right anyway. Was this the elk now that I said? Okay, nearly. But anyway, these sounds must be learned also. And it's not so easy, as we all know from learning foreign languages later in life. And these sounds are learned incredibly early in life. For example, laboratories made studies with babies. As you can see, who is sucking, I don't know how you call it in English. Pacifier. Sorry? Pacifier. Pacifier. That sounds like a pistol or Colt. The pacifier was also a Colt, yeah, something. Okay, no, this is a baby pacifier. And they attach to this a sensor of pressure. And babies have a habit of sucking faster when they experience something new. So one presented different syllables to them that are very close to each other. And by checking when the baby starts to suck quick again, one can see whether this new stimulus is perceived by the baby as being new or not new. By this you can, for example, determine whether it already is able to discriminate these very specific phonemes that exist in different languages. And here you can see that the toddler, as we have seen before, can discriminate the very similar sounds of pa and ba. Pa and ba, which is actually not a big difference. Because when you run the pa stimulus for a certain time, and then you change to the other stimulus, the other syllable ba, the baby realizes, there was something new, and starts to suck stronger, and you can see it in this graph. This is also analyzed with a different methodology. Just have a look at this method here. And I'm trying to find.
6-month-old Matthew sits on his mother's lap. A researcher sits opposite and keeps his attention on a colorful toy while a tape plays two sounds. One is ba and the other is da, a sound only used in Hindi and one which most English-speaking listeners can't distinguish from the English sound da. During the initial training period, A toy bunny is lit up in a large glass box to the side of Matthew the instant the da sound is played. When the ba sound is played, the bunny stops and Matthew turns back to the researcher. The routine continues until Matthew learns to associate the change from ba to da with the bunny. Matthew even turns his head in anticipation when the researchers delay the bunny's appearance. Matthew is now ready for the test phase of the experiment. A new tape is played, this time with two different da sounds that are only used in Hindi. Even though they are two completely different sounds, an adult who can't speak Hindi doesn't hear the difference. But Matthew immediately turns his head towards the bunny when he hears the change from one Hindi da to the other. Although he has never heard Hindi spoken, researchers recognize that at 6 months, he is still the universal listener, able to distinguish all sounds.
Another one that
Emma,
is
who is 4
older.
months older than Matthew, has come to the lab for the first time. After a similar training routine as Matthew, she's presented with the same problem of distinguishing the two different Hindi da sounds. But at this age, Emma, whose parents speak only English, doesn't react when there is a change from one to the other. She is more interested in the toy in front of her than the bunny. This leads the researchers to conclude that by 10 months, the baby human stops being the universal listener and, like the adult of the species, no longer hears the difference between the two sounds.
So it's a long time ago that you learned to distinguish the sounds that you, the Estonians, speak in Estonia. And that's the reason why it's for us so difficult later in age to learn foreign languages with the correct pronunciation. How do you teach kids languages? Do you really do, look, Carly, look here, this is a chair. Now you may want to sit on it. Come here and sit down. Do you say that? No. No. You don't say that. You teach kids by, hey, come over, sit down, and talk with me. Something like that. So you embed the language that you address to the child in everyday practices. You never teach it in a way that would be necessary for the classical learning theories to be applied. Which means that they cannot be right, the instrumental learning theories and others, because of our practice to speak with kids more or less in an adult way, which is good. And it's not so good if relatives or the family speaks to the baby in a baby language. That's not good at all, because baby languages are by definition restricted and do not use the whole vocabulary that we use as adults. So you can talk with kids even maybe about mathematical formula if you want, and it will be better than using losing baby language. Every interaction involves, of course, not only sounds but also behavior. And the gestures, the mimics that we show are becoming part of the language understanding of children. You can see here a sequence of 8 or 9 pictures taken in the interaction between a baby and his father, where you can see that not only sounds are being produced, but a lot of body movements that go with the sounds. And of course there are different cultures where you use the movements, the body movement, gesturing, more than in others, as we all know, being living in an Estonian culture. So when you go to Italy, of course, you're aware that the kids, the babies, have been addressed in a different way as maybe a typically Estonian child. So the gestures and the mimics are different. And out of this very informal interaction between parent and child comes out a very, very quick process of language learning. In the average, it's a word per day that a child learns. So, as you can see here from the statistics, at the age of 2, it's a very low number of words, of course, that has to do primarily with the immediate surroundings and the situation in the family. But quickly, until 7, the vocabulary available to children is extremely high, like 2,600 words or even higher. We have, of course, different capacities among different children, and girls sometimes are a little bit faster than boys, but in general, it's an increasingly, a very strong, very rapid process that lets us attain a language in childhood. And what I want to show with this is that what kids learn is what in linguistics is also important, particularly in pragmatics. That is, that the meaning of a word is in its use. The meaning of a word is not present in dictionaries. Well, yes, there also, but the real meaning is in the use, how it is being used, how it is being produced in a situation of social interaction. So what I want to say with this is that the criterion of a correct understanding of a word would be that I can mention it in a sentence in a social interaction situation, and I can see from my communicating partner if I said something correct or not immediately. So my little attempt to learn a little bit of Estonian language doesn't work yet, and I am not able to produce a sentence that is immediately understood from my counterpart when I try to speak here on the street. Estonian. This is something that all linguists know very well, but that sociologists, for example, are not so aware that the meaning has to do not only with a dictionary, but also with its complete social environment, like in this example. It's only understandable whoever has bought some IKEA furniture. So who has not yet used or bought an IKEA furniture? Everybody has, so you understand the joke. But this is completely situated use of please have a chair. Now, so you understand the situated meaning of that. And then there is a final point that I want to bring to you as an ontogenetic phenomenon. How do we come in the position to assume that others have a similar experience as we do in terms of emotions, in terms of affects, etc.? Why should it be that when you look at him and he moves as he does right now, look there, what's he doing with his face? Sorry?
Smiling.
Smiling. What does this mean, smiling?
To be happy.
To be happy. Where do you know that from? That his smiling reflects your feeling of happiness when you smile. Where do you know this from? This is a process that psychology is not so old yet, this theory or this approach. It's not older than 15 years or 20, the so-called theory of mind. We obviously possess the ability, or we have an ingrained understanding that our experiences, our mind experiences, our feelings, etc., are also present in other persons that we observe. Without this, no communication would be possible. So we have an expectation that others will react like we do in similar situations. We have a theory of mind that allows us to assume this. And in most of the cases, it's right, isn't it? Sometimes you may be frustrated in your assumption, but in the majority of cases, it's correct. Let me illustrate this with this nice movie here. Oh.
What do you think's inside this bag? Chocolate? Thanks, what's inside? Open it up.
Oh, thank you.
So it,
Cars.
Wow, were you surprised to see that? Because you thought chocolate was inside?
I always wanted my birthday to come.
Okay. Now, if Grandma were to come over right now, and we were to do the same thing, we were to hide these cards in here, and we said, Grandma, what do you think's inside this bag? What do you think she would say?
Chocolate?
Yeah, she would. Why?
Because it's a chocolate bag.
Right. And then she'd look inside and be surprised, right?
Yeah, it's in the bag.
Yeah. Good
Like
job.
a little laying on a plate.
this boy has an understanding that his grandmother will have the same mistaken assumption about chocolate being in this bag. And he understands, even knowing later that there is no chocolate in the bag, he understands that his grandma will fall into the same trap when confronted with this thing. I think that's a wonderful achievement that we have as humans to have an apparatus at hand that we can use to understand other people or what's going on in other people's heads. So language, in my opinion, is an ability the primary ability that enables human social life. And it has a strong reference or a strong basis in genetic processes. Where I must say that I talk about symbolic language, because machine communication, even though we call the communication between two machines, two computers, for example, also a language, it has nothing to do with the highly complex and extremely useful, viable language, symbolic language that we use. Machines are actually not talking, they are just communicating mechanically. So, so much to this topic. Now let's switch to the other one. I want to come to the end, actually, of this lecture, which has a little bit sad topic, downfall of cultures, the end of societies. Something that is being philosophized the last few years also in the context of climate change, etc. But before we start talking about this, let's do a quick reminder of what we talked in the first lecture. Just to repeat, modern culture came about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent in the Near East, West Asia. From there we found the first domesticated plants, the first domesticated animals that were being used regularly in the life of people. And once these agricultural achievements were attained, once the first bigger settlements were being formed, the newly constructed culture had the necessity to spread across the world. And it did, but in to different degrees, because you will remember that there is one very important ultimate factor in the diffusion of cultures. And that is the extension, the independent of our own activities, the extension of the continents, east-west or north-south. And it's absolutely logical that domesticated animals, domesticated fruits and grains, etc., are easier to transport and to communicate across the same climate zone than it is to transport or disseminate across the northwest divide or northwest stretch of, for example, Africa or the two Americas, which gave the people in Eurasia a big advantage in their cultural development, because they were ahead of people in any other continent, because of the ease of distributing or diffusing the newly acquired culture in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent. So that's why high technology, why developed societies came into being in Europe and in Eastern Asia, because of the interchange of cultural elements. At the beginning we talked about many continents, but not about Oceania and the Pacific region. The Pacific Ocean was settled or discovered by migration relatively late, with the exception of Australia. Australia was discovered when there was a land bridge between Asia and the Australian continent, across the islands of Indonesia nowadays that were lying dry in an ocean that was lower with a lower water level because of the ice age, the glacial, the masses of water being bound in the north of Eurasia. So there was 100 to 200 meters lower level of water, and people could simply walk from Asia to Australia. There was a different process with the Austronesian expansion in the Pacific. This occurred particularly very much later. As you can see here, the earliest population arrived in the Philippines 3,000 before Christ, meaning 5,000 years before our own age. And the further to the east the islands are, the later they were populated. And one of the latest populated regions is right at the right corner there. That's the Easter Island. And the Easter Island will be the first topic of our discussion today. Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui is a triangular island, volcanic like all islands in the Pacific. And it is characterized by a very difficult position there due to the ocean currents and due to the dominant winds, passat winds that are blowing there in this region. So if we look at the development of the culture there, of the Easter Islanders, then we know that about 1,500 years ago, very recently actually, they settled there first. They arrived by their little took and took, so to say, settled in this formerly uninhabited island. And there they were isolated more or less. They had some little commerce with other islands in the far, but primarily they were very isolated. And they had in this development a maximum inhabitation of 30,000 people. This was limited, of course, by the agricultural possibilities there. And 500 years after their arrival, this is exactly between 1,000 and 1,500 years after Christ, Anno Domini, they started to construct very impressive buildings and building sites that we even admire today. That were these funny figures, the statues, the moai, the heads, the anakena that are sitting on top of the figures, and the figures together with the heads are sitting or standing on a platform. And these things are extremely big, as we can see here. We found maximum examples of all these three entities, where the most heaviest platform weighs about 800 tons, which is metric tons I'm talking about, which is really extremely heavy. They were living and sustained by a horticulture. A horticulture is a small form of agriculture, where every family has more or less extended gardens that they tend, that they use to produce their food. And this horticulture is, of course, a little bit precarious due to the exposedness of the island in the eastern Pacific Ocean. Now, just to the illustration, these are the figures that we all know already or have seen on pictures. The biggest have hundreds of tons. Then these figures have heads on it, that the meaning of which we don't know yet. And they are together standing on a basis that gives them support. But here you can see one of the biggest, nearly 10-meter high statues that had to be transported from a quarry, a volcanic basalt quarry, where the figures have been produced, cut out of the stone. So you can imagine this is a lot of work, an extremely big lot of work. And there were hundreds of such figures around the island. So you can imagine many people working on these figures require a lot of food. Now a little jump. This unfinished figure in one of the quarries is an example of a sudden breakdown of a culture. It was not finished because while they were working on this figure, the whole society and the whole culture collapsed from one day of the next. So in the year 1722, Roggeveen, it was a Dutch seafarer, discoverer, arrived there, and they discovered an island that was naked from any tree or palm tree, and saw a population that was extremely miserable, malnourished, had no food, and was desperate. And the problem was to explain where did these statues come from that he could see around on the island. What we had there also before Roggeveen arrived was nothing else than a Stone Age society with the reduced possibilities of instruments and tools that you can have in a Stone Age society. He discovered also, or later we confirmed, that the horticulture was made possible not simply by planting trees or by planting our food plants, but was made possible by something that we call I just know the German word of this. But you use little stones in order to protect the little plants from the strong wind that was going across the island. And he could not discover, Roggeveen could not discover any big gardens or horticultures that were still working very well. Because as we know now, because the trees, the palm trees that had existed there, had completely disappeared, and the shadow of them that protected the little plants was gone. And then, of course, with Roggeveen and other discoverers later, there were European diseases that arrived and terminated more or less the population completely. Not completely, but more or less in a way that made a recovery impossible. So the archaeologists tried to understand how these statues, how these buildings have been produced. So they used wooden poles that must have been there in order to work with these big figures. And they used ropes that must have also been there at the time when they were constructed, these figures, in order to control the upbringing, the rise up of the statues. But before they can be put on a place, they must be transported. And this transport was done, of course, using poles that were, so to say, the wheels on which the stones, the slabs of the stone, were being rolled across. What biologists could discover or reconstruct of the older times, when there was a population there, was that the island was covered by a natural forest that was composed of little trees, 19 tree species, and of giant palm trees that were really giant because they were up to a diameter of 2 meters. Palm tree species that nowadays I don't think exists anywhere else. Not anywhere else in order to see it. These giant palm trees were the source or the resource of the most important building and construction tools, like, for example, the rollers for transport. The ropes could be done, made out of it. And the dresses that the islanders were wearing were partly also produced out of the palm tree fibers. And you could also build boats, etc., etc. And what was really a stupid idea, I must say, was to cremate the dead bodies of the islanders by using big fires, like in India nowadays. And this had the consequence that about 1,500 years after Christ, these palm trees disappeared completely. It disappeared completely from one day, more or less, to the next. And with it, the fate of the society was determined. A society that consisted, like many societies, out of common people, the lower level, the farmers or horticulturists, and nobility that was consisting of different factions of nobility that collaborated with priests in order to preserve the local power. And this nobility had, like most nobilities around the world, they liked to show off. No, of course, they had what we call nowadays conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption would be when you have a $10,000 Rolex watch on your arm, when you are driving a Maserati on the street, etc., etc. That's conspicuous consumption that few people of us ever have come. Well, you usually lack the idea of doing this because it's a little bit unusual and extremely expensive. But that's the point in it, to do stupid things in order to show that you can do them. That's conspicuous. You don't need it, but you do it because it's cementing, it's reifying, and it's symbolizing your power. And this conspicuous consumption consisted there in the construction of these unbelievable monuments, these unbelievable figures with their heads on it. And that actually determined the end of the society when the collapse occurred, and from one decade to the next, hunger and misery ravaged the whole island. Out of this hunger and misery, usually there comes revolts, and you had, after the downfall of the nobility, warlords who tried to gather what could be gathered in this destroyed society. At the end, we had endemic poverty that lasted until very recently, of course, and this included in years with very little food produced, up to anthropophagia, that is man-eating. But we must, as social scientists, we should ask, how does this collapse happen? How did this happen? I just told you that the island takes a very exposed position. It's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, not far from the, well, thousands of kilometers from the Chilean coast. We have strong passat winds blowing from, which direction would it be blowing there? Does anybody know about winds? Climate, weather? What about passat winds? In the northern hemisphere, how do they blow? Hello? They blow from the northwest to the southeast. In the southern, it's a mirror image, no? It's blowing from the southwest to the northeast. So the island was in the middle of the stream of these passat winds. Meaning that you needed to use a lot of protection for your plants. You needed the trees and the palms to break the strength of the wind. You needed the trees and the palms to stop or to at least shade the little growing food plants from the strong sun radiation. And then, unfortunately, from the commercial contacts the islanders had, the Easter Islanders had, with other islands in the Pacific, they imported unwittingly a kind of rats that stayed at the island and that had the bad habit of eating the nuts of the palm trees. And if you destroy the semen, so to say, of the palm trees, there will not come up new palm trees because you're cutting the recreational cycle. So the forests more and more could not regenerate. And of course, the construction of these conspicuous figures stopped or was made more, let's say, more difficult. And then you, given this social structure of nobility and of common man, together with the conspicuous consumption of these figures, made it necessary to have a very strong or high overproduction of food, because a high proportion of the common people was working in the quarries, producing the figures. And the other part, only the other part was able to participate in the production of food. So was doing horticulture, that was producing what the workers needed for their survival. That's the eternal problem of societies with a division of labor to have enough people left who produce the food that the others who are not productive in this way need for their survival. And then, as I mentioned already, one of the reasons was that the society treated these palm trees and the trees very badly. They not only used it for burning the dead, but also to produce the unproductive statues that had no practical meaning whatsoever. And of course, there's always the possibility that there might have been a climate swing. That's also being mentioned and discussed recently in context of the present so-called climate change. But for me, the question is, what did the person think who cut the last tree? What do you think? What would you think nowadays when the earth is empty, just one tree here? You cut it. What do you think when you do that?
Just following the orders.
Following the orders? Well, what do I care? It's not my business. I cut it.
You really exactly know that the last tree was actually cut.
Well, may well be, yes, of course, that it may not have been the last tree. But on such a small island, the islanders have an overview of what's growing, more or less, in all this. It's not a big island, very small in square kilometers. I don't know the size, but it's very small in a way that you can walk around in a day or two. So it's not so big.
And how far is the closest island?
Thousands of kilometers. We can go back later, maybe, and check it. But it's one of the most exposed islands that exist there. But actually, what does this person think? What do we think when we
This last tree won't say.
buy our last car
Doesn't
with the
say
last
anyone.
drip of or drop of gasoline?
This last tree wouldn't save anyone.
The last tree wouldn't save anyone, but with a little.
Beneficial to get
Yeah.
it for myself and let someone else come and
Yeah.
take it.
Finally, I have filled my boat.
And everybody else doesn't care. Doesn't matter. That's true, right. But what we have here is not an individual problem. It's a collective problem, of course. And a problem that could be analyzed in terms of collective mental and representational systems that may have existed at the time. Of course, we cannot make interviews with them anymore. But given the struggles that existed among the ruling class, the priests and nobility, we see that there was, of course, a competition for dominance. I don't know who of you has been in Bologna in Italy already. There are houses with these little, very slim towers that are relatively high, and they look very fragile actually. And I'm personally wondering why it's still standing, because they have sometimes earthquakes there. Anyway, you had this in the Renaissance time. They were built, and there were often different clans living side by side with their palaces or houses very close to each other. And what do you think was the driving force of these towers? It was to be bigger than the neighbor. So you build a bigger one, and then the neighbor builds still a little bit bigger one so he can spit on the roof of the other person. Whatever the motivation is, I mean, this also is a kind of conspicuous consumption, because it uses up resources for nonsensical means, for nonsensical uses, actually. The only sense behind it is maintaining the power position in a symbolic way, which translates very often into a real material power position. On the other hand, the common people, the same situation was in Rapa Nui on the Easter Island, because we know that different factions of the nobility was situated around, and each of them had a garden of these figures and a garden of these fundamental, these slabs that were used as fundament stones for the construction and erecting of the figures. So the more and the bigger figures you had, the more powerful you were symbolically. The common people, of course, had for a time an acceptable life. There was enough to eat. There was enough to work, even if it was senseless. They followed an unquestioned submission, so to say, and accepted the social order and the religious order that existed at the time, that was strongly hierarchical, obviously. When does this crisis then translate into disaster? That is exactly when the coping mechanisms fail because of rigid mentalities. Rigid mentalities that are not in the situation, not able to change early enough in time. That is when you have no flexibility in order to appreciate novelty, to appreciate a new approach to a problem. Because definitely the people must have noticed some decay over the decades of the downfall. Downfall was not happening, of course, from one second to the next. It was happening across decades, and the people observed that the conditions get harsher and harsher, and the food was less and less. But very often the power holders were not so much interested in the well-being of the society at large, but more in maintaining their power. And the problem is when the common people don't question the power structure and don't start to do something against it by nowadays playing the role of active minorities that have been discussed and actually analyzed by Serge Moscovici also at his school, by having intellectual discourse that questions the existing order, that helps to overcome limits of thinking, limits of discussing, limits of openness, then we are bound to face a crisis. Active minorities might not have existed at the time, and even intellectuals might not, in our present day understanding, have existed at the time. So this led to the crisis that did not, and the people were not able to cope early enough in order to stop the running process. So that was the Rapa Nui people, but let's now look at Greenland. Greenland, at about 1,300, the year 1,300 was colonized by the Vikings. Here we can see a reconstructed farmhouse here and the very famous Walsey Church in a bay of the southern part of Greenland. The Vikings came originally from Norway in the European north, traveled to Iceland and populated Iceland. Actually, there was a big colony, and out of there, the Red Eric, the big Red Eric, a very belligerent, strong man with a clan behind himself, started out to investigate the lands in the west of Iceland, sorry. And there was Greenland. He discovered Greenland in a way, gave rise to the first settlements, and then traveled over to northern America at a time when Columbus wasn't born yet, actually. I don't know the years right now. But Greenland was populated by two settlement groups. That was the southern or the eastern settlement here in the south, and the western settlement a little bit more to the north. that were villages of let's say, a few thousand people. The eastern, as the more southern settlement had about 4,000 inhabitants. The other one, 1,000 persons. And the settlers remained there between 900 to 1,400 years after Christ. That is a settlement period of 500 years. At the same time, when they arrived and settled there were the indigenous people in the north, the Inuit or Eskimos, who lived there already before and continued to live even after the Viking times. The Vikings tried to replicate their culture and agriculture that they were used to from Norway. That was primarily cattle culture. So they had the brought cattle with them and tried to cultivate them in Greenland in a way that was not very successful, because the biggest cattle were about a little bit higher than 1 meter, like this. That's nice, no? Very pet cattle. So to say, you could put it in your apartment and go out twice a day with it. Anyway, very small cattle. They had a few sheep and a few goats. And they were living, of course, due to the cattle culture, from the pastures. But on the other hand, because of the extended winters and the cold periods there, much colder than Estonia, they were living on hay. They had to harvest the pastures during summer in order to keep the hay for the long periods of winter for the cattle. So the cattle was primarily living in the stables and didn't see much of the sunlight that may have existed in summers there. They used the cattle for milk products. They did eat, in general, very little meat, because they used the cattle and cows primarily for milk. They surprisingly didn't use fish. They didn't discover that fish is a good resource for protein, and this was part of their problem and development of a problem later. And they had a highly integrated commercial contact with Norway, ship traffic, commuting between Norway and Greenland, where they got new produce that they couldn't produce themselves, products that were not present in Greenland itself. But again, you see, what they imported, or what they were interested in importing, was primarily symbolic stuff. Symbolic stuff that was conspicuous, expensive, things that they couldn't produce there, but that was primarily used for the churches and for religion. And out of this, there also existed a certain number of structural problems. These structural problems was the Eurocentrism, particularly the Christian identity that they brought with them, and the fashion and the dress code that were accompanying a cultural Christianity, which means that the very important products to dress that they could not produce there, like sufficient wool for dress, for weaving, etc., instead of using hides as the Eskimos did in the northern parts of Greenland. They themselves couldn't export many things in exchange for the products coming in from Norway. But one of the things was ivory, the walrus teeth that they went hunting in summer times, and ice bear hides, the big hides that the ice bear had, the nice white bear hide that they exported to Norway because they had no direct access to this. But the problem was, in order to maintain this kind of commerce, they had to take away part of the hands, part of the workers from the south who were usually been working on on harvesting the hay, in order to go hunting in the north during the summer season. So they had a structural problem in organizing the division of labor. And they left usually not enough people in the south to produce the hay that was necessary for their cows and other cattle that they had. And recurrent problem is the destruction of forests. There were, of course, very little forests, very few ones. And these few were very quickly destructed because wood is a very simple and easy to use building material, of course. We all know that. And they use it also for the houses, of course, for ships and for the heating of their winter houses. But this quickly led to the destruction of the few forests that existed there. And the problem is the clerical culture again, the Christian clerical European style way of existing, of having representative churches, representative masses, etc., brought about also a consumption that was not very productive. It led to the import of unnecessary stuff. And they were lucky because in this, they were arriving at a time when in the climate cycle, after in the last 2,000 years, there was a 500-year spell of warmth. That was the medieval warm time, or the medieval period where the climate was much milder than it is nowadays, or it was later. And they, of course, like everybody who thinks in terms of climate, thinks that this is a stable condition and will not change. And as I said already, they began to, or they never experienced or never learned to use fishery as a resource for food. Socially or societally, they were a very conservative culture. They were strongly hierarchical again. They had this dominant families and then the priests that dominated a larger part of common men. And at the end, actually, they experienced a downfall. First, at 1,400 years ago, we see that here the Little Ice Age started. Little Ice Age also started continued about 500 years and lasted until the 19th century, the beginnings of the last century, 20th century. That was a period where Europe was actually experiencing food shortage also because of the Little Ice Age, because of the little radiation that the sun produced into the Earth's atmosphere. Then, unfortunately, in Norway there was a period of plague. People died in the masses, in the thousands, and the remaining Norwegians had little interest to travel to Greenland to bring supplies to the Vikings there. And again, we are in the process of coping. They were incapable of coping in a creative way with the end of agriculture, of how to replace it, for example. They were unable to adapt to this new situation because of a very rigid, fixed way of thinking. They were unable to copy some cultural practices from the Inuit, who very well understood how to survive in bad climates. They used, for example, dog sledges instead of cow carriages. They used a lot of fish, of course, but all these achievements that the Inuits had were not valued because these were the wild ones, the savage, the Skrælings, that were not worth it to look at them. Okay? And this, at the end, led to a relatively quick, within one generation, to a relatively quick downfall of the Viking colony. That disappeared completely. So if you want to extract the most important factors in societal collapse, we come to first to a factor that we know very well from our own ecological discussions. That's ecological damage. Once you start in nature a feeding back process, with a process with a positive feedback, that you cannot stop anymore because it runs away, a runaway process, then you are in bad waters. And it's the problem that you must face, that this part of the ecology will go away and you cannot use it anymore. That was one of the factors that was dominant in Rapa Nui. Then a lack of collective coping with the problems. They saw the problems coming. It was getting a little bit colder. The cows were just very small, gave little milk. The pastures were producing less things. They were not able to imitate, to learn from the people that have been living there for millennia, the Inuit or Eskimos, because they devalued them. They were not worthy of attention. They were just not cultivated. We, the Christians, are the better ones. There were, of course, natural swings of climate, and that led to the downfall of the Anasazi culture in the Arizona region of the United States, and of the Maya culture in the southern part of Mexico nowadays. We assume that it was natural swings of climate that led to arid spells, arid periods that the people were not able to survive. And then another general factor, of course, is the exhaustion of resources. When we have our computers here and we use our telephone, our mobile phone, few people think of the resources that are being bound there. We have rare earth elements being necessary for building chips, computer chips, for building the screens that we use, the flat screens that we use in our devices, etc., etc. And these are resources that are limited. Everybody knows that, but still we produce these things with a high input of these very rare natural resources. And then losing commerce partners is, of course, also a problem, as we can see with the Vikings, because once the Norwegians hesitated to run a monthly supply chain to Greenland, they came into serious problems. And the last one is that you have maybe unfriendly neighbors that want to bring you bad luck. And that was the case with the Romans, for example. Not with the two examples that we discussed today. But let's now come to more recent things. Let's look at ecological footprints. An ecological footprint is a measure that allows us to estimate how many of the renewable resources do you use that can be, per year, for example, that can be reproduced or that can be renewed within a reasonable period of time. And you can cross-tabulate the ecological footprint that you can calculate from the technological advance, technological development, and of the energy resource consumption in a country. You can cross-tabulate it with the Human Development Index. That's an index that the United Nations or scientists with UNESCO, etc., have developed in order to measure the level of development in a country. There we can see that the poor African nations, that's the red thing here, are the lowest in the Human Development Index, and they are also very ecologically friendly in their life, of course. They have no civilized lifestyle as we are used to. Then we find Cuba, interestingly, that has a footprint of 1, which means an exactly ecology-friendly way of living. And I think the jokes that we always make about the old cars that they are using, that are sometimes 30 or 40 years old, are out of place, because that helps them. As long as these cars go, they're okay. No, they're okay. I might not use old cars. And then we go to the right with the ever higher ecological footprint, using much more than can be renewed out of the resources. Like the top is one Middle Eastern or Central Asian country and the USA. Norway, Canada, Australia follow suit. And most of the European countries are somewhere here in this region. Europe is the triangle, the greenish triangles that follow in this region. Also, they are, as countries, living beyond the renewable region. So how do we interpret this? Let's look at the social psychological factors in potential scenarios of downfall. First, are there, or do we have to think of reified representational systems that do not allow to change your thinking about a certain upcoming problem? Then we usually have, as we discussed and saw in the social construction lecture, we have institutions that are immune to adaptation and change. We have societies where open discourse and critical discourse, doubting the present system of doing economy, for example, is suppressed or in a way deviated such that it cannot develop. And it's always bad to have a strong division in a society in haves and have-nots, meaning the hiatus, the difference between the riches and the poors. And this is reflected in the Gini index. The Gini index, for example, is an index constructed out of the Lorenz curve, meaning that if you had an equal distribution of how shall I say, value or income in a society, the society would be in the diagonal of this triangle, where the horizontal axis reflects the share of people from the lowest to the highest incomes. That is a more or less equal distribution across society, from poorer ones to richer ones that are still poorer and richer, but not in a completely, how shall I say, in a completely separate way. The more down the Lorenz curve goes, the stronger, or the more we have a big faction of very poor that don't possess a lot of value of money or of other sources of income, and a small portion of rich people who possess an incomparable amount of income, or let's say of money resources, meaning that the highest 10% of income 10% of the richest people in a society possess, let's say, 90% of the whole income of in this society. And if we calculate the one version of the Gini index or Gini coefficient, we see here a reflection. The higher the value, and the more red the value, the more a society or a culture is out of equilibrium, let's say. Out of equilibrium means that the richest possess an unbelievably big amount of the income within the country. Europe, you can see, is relatively moderate still, but it has been increasing the last 10 years very much, as we know from other calculations. So these are global indicators of problems that we may face. And in order to get an image of what we may face, let's go through the different criteria or the different factors that we saw with the two cultures that I presented today. So let's answer the question. Is there nowadays an unprecedented exploitation of difficult to replace raw materials? I've already mentioned the raw materials that we use for telephones, like coltan, that's cobalt and another mineral, copper, silver, gold, and the rare earth minerals. Do we do this or do we not? Do we change our iPhone every 2 years or do we not? Etc., etc. Do we have a nobility, in quotation marks, that accumulates value and money at an unprecedented rate? Well, given the increase in the difference between rich and poor in many, also in European countries, we do have something like that. And the nobility nowadays, the money nobility, accumulates, in fact, very much more than the rest of of European societies can ever dream of. Where does it come from? Not only from the productive industries that produce things that we can use in practice, in use for practical work, for good work, things, but they also earn from producing weapons. And weapons is one of the stupidest inventions, or let's say the stupidest things that you can produce because they're not productive. It's binding capital in a way that cannot be used for other things. Now, of course, there are sometimes tensions between countries, and it's good if you have a certain capacity to defend yourself, just in case. But exaggerating this accumulation of weapons, as recently has been a topic again in discussions of the NATO, is just unbelievably stupid. Then, do we have a widening gulf between the rich and the poor in the world, in some countries, in the dominant countries of the world? Both within countries as well as between countries across the globe. Then, do we see any indication of a likelihood of climate change, maybe? Do we see that? That may be very imprevisible, may come quickly, actually. The dip. Does there exist a lot of war, unrest, and expressed interest in world dominance by one or more countries? That is, do we have threatening others, or do we perceive or construct threatening others that we think we must defend ourselves? And they think the same, they also feel threatened. So let us build or use the resources that we have for constructing more surveillance, more weapons, more tanks, more airplanes and missiles and rockets, etc. And do we already see some ecological damage somewhere? Do we see that? Well, large parts of northern Africa depopulating because of the Sahara extending more and more to the south. We have, this year is a particularly strong El Niño. That's the climatic phenomenon in the Pacific that produces a wrong, quotation marks, a wrong distribution of hot and cold waters in the in the west and east of the Pacific Ocean, and which has as a consequence strong climatic and weather disasters on the two sides of the Pacific Ocean in South America as well as in the southern parts of Asia. Big cyclones that are wandering across the Philippines, etc., etc. Do we have this?
Yes,
Most of it,
also
yes.
in Syria, I read somewhere that the soil is totally drawn out of all the nutrients, and after that people got uneasy, and after that they started fighting each other.
Yeah. Fighting, warring groups
Yes.
often come out of ecological problems because they start trying to occupy the last resources that exist in a country, for example. And the next big migration wave will be when the Pacific Islands go underwater, which is going to happen in the next 100 years, let's say. So, who is it who benefits from these things? From the increase of weapons production, from the exploitation of non-replaceable mineral resources, etc., etc. Who is it? Is it you? If not, then what are you waiting for to do something? And with this, I stop. Thank you very much.